So in the Diablo 4 beta, once I finally got my hand on the Necromancer, I was so stoked to finally be able to try out some version of a summon Necromancer, try to recall some of that Fishy Mancer glory from D2, and ultimately it turned out that I really couldn't make it work. Or rather, let me rephrase that. It's not that I couldn't make it work. Every single build crushed the beta. You were level 25 with gear, you would crush all content that was there. But what I couldn't find was a nugget of a build that I believe would legitimately scale into the end game. Summons are absolutely going to fall off just looking at what tools are currently online and what we've seen from the Codex of Power and the aspects that people were able to drop during the beta. Unless there's some ridiculous stuff in the endgame, which, obviously I can't pretend to know that. The summon skeletons aren't going to be as powerful as you might think. Now, I have come up with some theorycrafted builds that I think will make it work, but what I'm actually really excited to show you is a build that I think not only has great single target and AoE potential, boss killing speed, density killing speed, works well on the world boss, I assume it will do pretty decent in PvP, but we'll have to see obviously, is a Sever build, because Sever actually scales off of how many summons that you have as a base damage upgrade. So what I have for you is gameplay from when I was testing this out during the beta, and then a level 50 character with their full renown, so 58 total skill points, and a skill tree that I think will be able to work in the end game, has great scalability, and this is without aspects or Paragon. I'm just going to show you the skill tree, kind of talk about the decisions that I made and why we did, and then leave it up to you to decide whether or not you think it's a good build. Let's find out. So as I said, this is going to be a max skill point character. That means levels 1 through 50, you get a total of 48 points, and then you get 10 points from the renown system. That's how we end up at 58 here. And I'll go through the entire skill build, and again, explain why we made the decisions that we did, why we're speccing into the things that we are, and what I ultimately think its total output will be. So it starts off fairly simple. We are like the Grim Reaper build here. If you didn't see Sever, again, just checking out the gameplay footage, it's really cool. It summons this sick spectral avatar of yourself in like a full skeleton mode. It dashes forward, dealing damage as it travels, then does an AoE around it, and then it dashes back towards you, again dealing damage, and then an AoE around you. So if you're close enough to a target and you space it out properly, you can hit the same person with 4 instances of damage just from this one skill. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Now, the big thing about Reap, or at least the important things about Reap, is that it generates essence per target hit, and since it's an AoE attack, you can generate a ton of essence per animation, which is really good. You get into the thick of things, use a single Reap, completely refill your essence, and then you start dominating with Sever. The enhanced Reap really isn't important, but technically speaking, if an enemy hit with Reap dies within 2 seconds, you gain additional attack speed. That is cool because you can kind of intersperse the Reap animation in between your Severs, not only getting you essence back, but the second reason why Reap is so important is because of Acolyte's Reap, which basically says generating a corpse on demand. Every 5 seconds, you can just instantaneously generate a corpse whenever you use this attack. And that allows us to start every fight with Corpse Tendrils. Corpse Tendrils is going to add slow, stun, invulnerable to all targets, and even though it can't slow and stun a boss monster, it will apply stagger and still apply that vulnerable. Down in the core skill tree, we're obviously maxing out Sever. Again, this can hit up to 4 times. Once you have the secondary enhancement, which says that it deals damage as it travels according to its initial damage. So just remember that Sever has an initial damage that it deals, which is its biggest damage when it lands on the target that you indicate, and then when you come back, it deals a smaller amount of damage. So the travel damage or the pathing damage that it does is actually based off of the initial damage or the biggest damage that is dealt. Now, the reason why the build is secretly a summon focused build is because Sever deals additional multiplicative damage for each minion that you have. So we're going to be picking every option that says having additional minions, as well as actually having uses for the aspects that say that you have additional Tendril, Skeletal Warriors, and Mages, because each one of those aspects basically just says 4% additional damage on your Sever. Now, ultimately, we won't be using a Golem in the endgame because we need more spots for CC and damage scaling abilities, but in the early game, you actually get to continue to use your Golem, which continues to buff your Sever damage here. Now, for the passives in this node, I think you obviously max out Imperfectly Balanced. I think you basically do this on every single core skill focused Necromancer build because it basically says plus 30% damage for almost no increase. Now, you might think core skills costing additional 15% more essence is a big number, but how much essence increase is that really? For Sever costs 20 essence. So increasing this by 15% is actually increasing this by 3 essence. That is a negligible amount of essence for the increase in damage that you get from Imperfectly Balanced. And on your first cast, Unliving Energy here, just increasing your maximum essence by 3, effectively negates this effect, at least on a single cast. Hued Flesh here is definitely great, don't get me wrong. The lucky hit chance to be able to generate a corpse, which is doubled against bosses, this is really important. Sever has a lucky hit chance of 20%. What we ultimately need Hued Flesh for is actually for one of the few ways of stacking direct amounts of Fortify on this build, which I am assuming is going to be incredibly important in the end game. The fact that Fortify is so restricted, overall survivability is so restricted, lets me know that being able to survive the end game is going to be a challenge. So this is one of the few means that we have of actively increasing our survivability later on in the tree. We are picking up the 3 points into Skeletal Warrior Mastery. Not only early on is this one of the strongest scalers for overall damage that you can have, considering your skeletons are free to summon, and 45% base damage increase on them is nothing to sneeze at. It also goes a long way to help keep them alive, so we can always rely on having them up so that our Sever's damage, which scales off of minions alive, will be as consistent as possible. We are picking up Corpse Explosion, but the slightly interesting thing here, which will make sense how this is ultimately just a shadow damage vehicle that's resting on the back of summons, is that we are using Blighted Corpse Explosion. Blighted Corpse Explosion takes the base Corpse Explosion, turns it into an AoE Darkness skill, and it's going to do tick damage every second to the target. And while you are doing more damage than you typically would with a base Corpse Explosion cast, you'll see the difference here of 75% versus 110% for all intents and purposes. Remember that dot damage cannot crit, so the base Corpse Explosion could crit if it were to hit a monster, but this won't. That is important to keep in mind. Ultimately, while the damage on the Corpse Explosion here is more supplementary to the build, it is overall important for helping to keep up consistent DPS, especially against tanky single targets and bosses. We're going to pick up the 1 point Grim Harvest that we need. This will help to make essence generation a little bit easier, especially considering the fact that consuming a corpse also triggers off of whenever we summon our skeletons with the Raise Skeleton skill, as well as summoning a Skeletal Priest, which heals them and buffs their damage. So even if we're not using Corpse Explosion, just consuming the corpses by healing our minions goes a long way to generate essence, and then what we really want out of it, which is increasing our damage for 4 seconds after corpse consumption. One of the interesting parts about the Necromancer is that you can't bring the corpses with you. So while you could just waste it by corpse exploding monsters that were in a pack behind you so that you would have this skill up as often as possible, I like the fact that using the Raise Skeletal skill will not only, again, heal our skeletons as well as increase their damage as they're walking into the next fight, but it will keep the Fueled by Death buff on us as consistently as possible. So every time you're leaving a pack after killing them, just consuming a corpse behind you to get this buff on you so that when you walk into the next pack, you're already dealing maximum damage is a great way to keep your damage output as consistent and high as possible. Down in the Corruption tree, or basically the Curse tree, we are going to be using Decrepify. Being able to apply slow on demand to the target is really important for the Shadow Darkness skill passives that we're going to pick up in the next node. The Lucky Hit ability to be able to stun them again goes a long way to increase that damage down below, and also just generally increasing survivability by being able to apply more crowd control more consistently. But the Horrid Decrepify buff here basically says everything that isn't a boss only has 90% of its base life. Considering we're going to have so many instances of ping damage, whether it's our skeletons, skeletal mages, the AoE damage from our Corpse Explosion, or the multiple damage sources from Sever, the moment that a monster drops down to 10% life, they're going to die almost instantaneously. And I can't stress this enough, monsters just having base 90% life is definitely one of the strongest tools in the kit of the Necromancer overall, just for increasing farm efficiency. For the rest of the passives in this tree, we are going to pick up Death's Embrace. We are going to be building this character as a close combat character because, again, Sever can hit multiple times on the same target as long as the distance between you and them are all kind of within this same little AoE, and then this also will decrease the damage that we take because of that dual nature of it, increasing our damage and decreasing their damage. And then obviously we're picking up amplified damage because if you're using a curse, you should be maxing this out, just an additional X9% damage multiplier on any target that is affected by the curse. And this also works on boss monsters, even though the slow and the stun won't apply to them, they'll still get the stagger effect and they'll still take this increased damage because Amplify is on them. We also pick up a single point in Skeletal Mage Mastery. The way it works out is that this is just kind of the best place to put a point so we can get down to level 35 and pick up Shadowblight, but on top of that, it is nice for our mages to just be able to put out additional damage as well as be able to take additional damage without dying. I wish we could have more points to be able to put into this. I do think it's more important to just prioritize a lot of the other passives and maxing out a lot of different skills that we normally would, but if there was some world where you were looking for a place to kind of shift up your points a little bit, I would max this out as well. Since we are using the Shadow Mages, which I'll go over at the end of this, but their damage isn't inconsequential and we would like for it to be as high as possible. Obviously, we're picking up Corpse Tendrils. Corpse Tendrils is actually just the strongest skill that the Necromancer has. I see some people asking a question like, do you need to use Corpse Tendrils? What about Bone Prison plus Cast Blight, and then Blight also pulls in enemies, which is a cool CC ability, don't get me wrong. But Corpse Tendrils says, Pixel pull all monsters to the same space, drastically increasing all AoE and small area of affected damage effectiveness because of the fact that everything's in the same spot. It also applies a slow, it also stuns them, and then it also applies vulnerable. Which again, the vulnerable will be applied to a boss target even if they aren't slowed or stunned by Corpse Tendrils, but this thing is just absolutely gross. One of the important things to know about it though is that it doesn't consider itself to be consuming a corpse, which is good. We want to be able to use that corpse for corpse explosion or raising a skeleton or healing them and increasing their damage. But it is important to know that spamming Corpse Tendrils between fights won't have the same effect as just spamming Corpse Explosion for the purposes of keeping your Fueled by Death active as long as possible. And then here's when we get to the most important passives and why we make the decisions that we do for them, and it's these three at the top namely. So Reaper's Pursuit isn't super important. You need to put a point in here. There's kind of no way around it, obviously. It does help a little bit to just have that consistent movement speed buff between packs, meaning you get from one pack to the next pack faster than you normally would. Gloom is incredibly important, as well as Terror, and they basically both just say doing shadow damage increases shadow damage that you do. This one in particular says that as long as you're dumping out consistent shadow damage, you and your minions are able to do up to X 18% additional damage against any monster that you're fighting. Considering Sever, again, is going to hit multiple times, Shadow Mages are going to hit multiple times, and the dot from Corpse Explosion will hit multiple times, this should be maxed out during any fight that happens to last longer than 3 seconds. And then Terror, which again says X 18% damage if you're attacking anybody who is slowed, as well as stunned or immobilized. They do stack and they do apply to your minions as well. This is again why it's so important to have continuous Decrepify up for that slow effect, the fact that you can stun with Decrepify as well based off of Lucky Hit, and then Corpse Tendrils automatically applying slow as well as stun with its enhancement. So all in all, any fight against any target, you should have a maximum bonus of both of these up. Now, the stun portion of it or the immobilized portion of it won't apply to any boss unless they become staggered, at which point they become stunned. So you will see an increased amount of damage when a boss monster becomes staggered in a fight. So that's why it's really important to have continuous applications of slow and stun, which is another reason why I think that this build in general is going to be so good for single target and boss kill speed, because in a lot of instances, it's actually kind of hard to prioritize just doing as much damage as possible, as well as actually staggering a boss. And altogether, these things say that while you are fighting with Decrepify up, since you have so many instances of damage going so often, you are going to be applying stagger at a very consistent and appreciable rate. And that's without stacking on anything else ridiculous from Aspects or Paragon board. And then, like I said earlier, we are using Necrotic Carapace, and this is to get any amount of Fortify onto our build at all for whenever a corpse is formed from our skills. And again, that's why we're using Hewed Flesh earlier on. While the corpses are useful for stacking damage as well from Corpse Explosion, this is really why we're using it, since this is the only avenue that we have as a purely darkness build. You'll notice that we're not using any ultimate abilities. We actually just don't have the skill space for it. And ultimately what we're really building to is the Shadowblight passive. So if you don't already understand how Shadowblight works, it's fairly simple. You doing shadow damage at all to a target gives it a single tick of Shadow Blight, and that lasts for 2 seconds. If a monster has Shadow Blight on it, you and your minions just do X 10% additional multiplicative damage to that target. So it's just, at worst, 10% additional damage overall on your kit. And then the 10th time that a monster successfully receives shadow damage from you or your minions, that instance of damage will deal an additional 20% damage. And then the last thing that's important, and I think this is where you actually have wiggle room. You basically have 7 points that you can move out to the rest of the build that you really wanted to. You'll notice that I'm not using Crippling Darkness. I think that this might be wrong. Even just putting a single point into Crippling Darkness might actually be the way to go, just to get that base lucky hit chance to stun, which would go a long way to help increase the damage from terror. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and do that right now. I'm actually going to take this out of here, and I'm just going to put the 1 point into Crippling Darkness. So as a quick review, just a single dump point in this bare minimum, just so that you have a consistent way of applying stun, which is again, applying more stagger to bosses, as well as just increasing your damage output against average monsters and any tankier monsters. But the other 6 points, which I do think that these are in the best place that they can be, would first be 3 points into Inspiring Leader. This says that after you've been healthy, so above 80% of your maximum life, for 4 seconds, you and your minions gain 12% increased attack speed. This is important because your increased attack speed increases the speed at which all of your animations go off. So your Severs will go out more quickly, your Reap will apply more quickly, your ability to cast Corpse Explosion will be faster, etc. On top of that, it increases the attack speed of all of your minions. So they're going to be doing more damage, and they're going to be applying shadow damage from your Shadow Mages faster, so that you're getting Shadow Blight ticks faster as well. And then the second one being Hellbent Commander, 3 points here, gains your minions 30% additional damage while you are close to them. And since we are built as a close damage build to maximize Sever's output, this means that basically your minion should just always be doing X 30% additional damage. And since we are relying on our summons quite a bit, their damage is consequential. But if you really wanted to, I think that you could ultimately take these 6 points and move them to anywhere else in the skill tree where you feel like you want that particular bonus, or maybe increasing the length of time or the effectiveness of Decrepify, which I think is a bit of a trap, but you might not. But again, you could kind of move these points around as you see fit to more naturally shore up any of the issues that your build is having, whether or not you have the gear or the aspects, etc., when we are walking into the end game. And to just very quickly go over the Book of the Dead, now I am only considering the Bone Golem down in the bottom. I think ultimately you would sacrifice any of your golems because they really can't fit on the build, because we're using Decrep and Corpse Tendrils, so we only have 5 total skill spaces since we're keeping the Raised Skeleton ability. But I'm only considering Bone because that's the only thing that we've seen in game. I'm not going to show you anything that we haven't seen in game because, well, you know, mega terms of service, etc. But either way, there are things you could go look up on the internet, I'm positive, and you can go read up on stuff if you wanted to, and you could change the decision that you would make. But I do think that sacrificing Bone Golem is the best one. Okay, enough of that. We're using Skeletal Skirmishers. I need to sit down and really figure out whether or not the Reapers ultimately put out more damage than the Skirmishers do. My understanding is that the Skirmishers should be putting out more damage. That's kind of their whole point. That's why they're a bit weaker and have reduced life. There's a secondary benefit of these Skirmishers as well, which is the ability to raise an additional Skirmisher, because this directly increases the amount of Sever damage that we have by having more minions available. If it turns out that having Reapers out just outperforms the damage of skirmishers, which I need to sit down and test more specifically, then you would actually use this one with the ability to carve off flesh and have more corpses available in general. For skeletal mages, we are using the shadow mages to have more instances of shadow damage, as well as increasing the amount of times that Shadowblight passive will proc, and we're using the effect that says that every 6 bolt actually fires out an additional shadow bolt. Again, increasing Shadowblight passive effectiveness, as well as just increasing their total shadow damage. And then we are sacrificing the Bone Golem, which is going to give us just that increased attack speed, again, increasing the animation rate for all of our skills, as well as our minions are going to gain 30% of that increased attack speed, so 3% increased attack speed from this. So not only does it buff us and our ability to put out damage, but it also buffs our minions by proxy. There you have it. That's what I think a legitimate summon focus build using the massive strength from the skill Sever is going to look like when you walk into the game starting off at level 1 and eventually getting to maximum skill point level, which is level 50. So I hope that you found this interesting. I know a lot of this is very speculative, but if you're like me, I just can't wait to get my hands on Diablo 4. So I'm sitting down with all these tools and I'm thinking as far ahead into the future as I possibly can without actually having the game to test each individual stat as I sit there and theorycraft it. And at the very least, I hope that you found this entertaining. If you were thinking about a similar build, or you think that there are some massive changes that you would ultimately find more efficient or better on this build, please let me know. Obviously, everything starts to look a lot different when you have Paragon and aspects, but even just the aspects that we've already seen in game give you a lot of tools for scaling this damage as well. So just the Edge Master saying that you deal more damage based off of how much resource you have means that your initial cast of Sever is just that much stronger, and each subsequent one is still even a little bit stronger. All the aspects that say that you have additional skeletons, or your skeletons deal more damage after they've been alive for a certain amount of time, or your skeletons attack more quickly, are ways of filling out the rest of the build. Because ultimately your gloves, your amulet, and your weapon should be the things that scale your damage the most, like consuming a corpse increases your core skill damage. But then the rest of the aspects that you can put onto your build, which aren't necessarily offensive aspects like utility or mobility or resource ones, go a long way to kind of help fill it out as well. Again, I didn't want to show aspects in this video because, one, there's a ton of aspects I didn't personally see yet in the game, and even when all of our community came together and kind of showed us all the aspects that they had picked up, I know that there are sources on the internet that have all the aspects, supposedly. I would always recommend just kind of looking at any data mined information with a bit of a grain of salt and a shrewd eye, because anything could change. But I just wanted to give a skill tree, because at the very least, we know what the skill tree said. And ultimately, that's going to be the most important thing, right? That's where you're going to be putting your points. And if you don't get the gear, you at least need to be able to rely on those skills. So again, I hope that this helps. Thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.